Hey guys, welcome to BudgetEDH. I'm your host Mike, and on this week's episode we bring you Omnath, Locus of Creation at a $100 budget. If you're looking for singles, sealed product, accessories, and more, check out tcgplayer.com. If you use our affiliate link while you shop, it helps support the channel and doesn't cost you anything extra. Another way that you can support us is directly on patreon.com/budgetedh. There you'll find different rewards and tiers, including a tier where we'll build you a deck and then feature it on one of our episodes and then ship you the deck with all the cards, sleeves, deck box, and everything to go with it. If you're looking for the best products to help protect your Magic cards, sleeves, binders, deck boxes, check out dragonshield.com. We have our affiliate link down below. If you go there, it'll help support the channel and help us make future content. Omnath is a red, a green, a white, and a blue for a legendary creature elemental out of Zendikar Rising. It has Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 4 life if this is the first time this ability has resolved this turn. If it's the second time, add red, green, white, and blue to your mana pool. If it's the third time, Omnath deals 4 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker you don't control. Omnath is a lands matters deck. He has quite a few abilities on him that whenever you play a land, you get additional value, especially if you play multiple lands in a turn. So some ways that we're able to do that is with cards that allow us to play additional lands each turn, which we do have a few, but most of those are pretty expensive. So we do have a lot of ways of ramping in here and putting additional lands onto the battlefield each turn. There's tons of ramp in this deck, and we want to make sure that we're able to hit our land drops and get Omnath out as quickly as possible so that we can start accruing that additional value and to start to spiral out of control. What would a Lands Matters deck be without landfall cards? And we do have quite a few of those in here. A lot of ways of generating additional value whenever we put a land from our hand onto the battlefield. While we don't have a ton of card draw in this deck, we do have some of the most powerful card draw spells that there are to offer in a landfall deck, giving us ways of drawing additional cards whenever we play lands or whenever we play creatures as well. We do have a couple of ways that we can win the game with this deck. We have a lot of landfall cards that generate us a lot of tokens, so we can use those tokens to swing out and get some damage in our opponents. We have some landfall cards that deal damage whenever we put lands onto the battlefield to our opponents. And then we do also have a powerful combo finish that we can use to win the game as well. Let's go over the stats that we have in this deck. So we've got 22 ramp cards, which is a ton of ramp spells. This is a landfall deck, so we do want as many ramp spells as we can fit into here. We've got 11 card draw spells. While not a ton, a lot of our card draw spells generate us additional draws off of each turn that they stay on the battlefield, which is very powerful. We do have 14 landfall cards in here, most of which generate us a ton of value, like putting tokens onto the battlefield or dealing damage to our opponents. We've only got 7 interaction spells in here, which this is not a control deck, so we just want some ways of dealing with problematic permanents that may come up that inhibit our way of winning the game. And then since this is a lands deck, we do have an increased amount of lands in here. We do have 41 lands. We want to make sure that we're able to hit all of our early drops and ramp out. And then there is a major focus on green mana, so most of our mana is green with splashes in the other colors as well. First up, let's get into the ramp that we have in this deck. So first up, we have some of our ramp spells that don't put lands directly onto the battlefield, which is what we mostly have in this deck. But there are a couple of really powerful cards that don't put lands on the battlefield, but will ramp you significantly in this deck or fix your colors in a way that makes them very powerful. So first up, we have Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, and Feyburrow Elder. I really like Feyburrow Elder in this deck and any deck really that can use it. It's a very powerful mana dork, giving you the ability to tap for each color among permanents that you control. It's similar to Bloom Tender, but at a fraction of the cost. Next up, we're going to talk about all the ways that we're able to put lands onto the battlefield, which is the name of the game in this deck. We do want to be able to get our landfall triggers. We have a lot of landfall cards in here. So putting lands on the battlefield is more important than any other ramp that we could have in this deck. So first up, we've got Growth Spiral and Explore. They both let you draw a card and play an additional land. And then Rampant Growth searches your library for a land card, puts it on the battlefield tapped. And we've got Farseek, Sakura Tribe Elder, and Cultivate. These are going to help you find land cards and put them onto the battlefield. Cultivate also lets you put one into your hand as well. Next up, we've got Harrow, Roiling Regrowth, and Springbloom Druid. These all let you sacrifice a land and then put additional lands onto the battlefield. Harrow lets you put them on untapped, and the other two put them onto the battlefield tapped. Then we've got Kodama's Reach, Migration Path, and Vastwood Surge. Kodama's Reach is the same thing as Cultivate, and Migration Path and Vastwood Surge are explosive vegetations with a little bit of an upside. Migration Path letting you cycle, and Vastwood Surge letting you put counters onto creatures if you kick it, which is important in this deck because we do have quite a few tokens in here, so this does give you some additional value if you play it for its kicker cost. And then last but not least, we do have Sky Shroud Claim. This lets you search your library for up to 2 forest cards, put them onto the battlefield, battlefield, and then shuffle your library. Next up, let's talk about some of the card draw that we have in here. So first up, we've got Locus Exploration. It's got Landfall. Whenever you play a land, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. So this gives you a pseudo card draw by exiling the top card of your library. Beginning of your end step, if there are cards exiled with Locus Exploration, put them into their owner's graveyard, then it deals that much damage to each opponent. So this can get you some additional damage and also help you draw some cards. Urban Evolution lets you draw 3 cards and you can play an additional land. And then Return of the Wild Speakers, one of my favorite cards. It has 2 modes on it. Draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, and non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. I love this card because it is modal and gives you some flexibility. If you got a bunch of plant tokens that you may get off of Phylath, you can just give them all +3/+3 and swing out and hopefully finish the game with that. So it can be a finisher or a card draw spell. Escape to the Wilds is a card that was just banned in Standard, and I do like it in this deck because it does give you some additional value and works really well with Omnath, as we saw in Standard when it got banned. It lets you exile the top 5 cards of your library, and you can play them until the end of your next turn, and then you can play an additional land this turn as well. Genesis Ultimatum, you get to look at the top 5 cards of your library and put any number of permanent cards from among them onto the battlefield and the rest into your hand, and then you can exile it. Horn of Greed is great in this deck. Whenever a player plays a land, that player draws a card. This does work for your opponents as well, but this deck is built to take advantage of this card, and your opponent's decks most likely will not be, giving you a ton of additional value whenever you put a land onto the battlefield. Then we've got Tatiova Benthic Druid. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under control, you gain a life and draw a card. We've also got Chulane, Teller of Tales. Whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card, then you can put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. It also gives you a way of bouncing creatures you control back to your hand if you got powerful ETB abilities. Zendikar Resurgent also lets you draw a card whenever you cast a creature spell, and it also will double your mana, which is really powerful. And then last but not least, we've got a new one out of Commander Legends that was just spoiled the other day. It's Icy Tyrant of Gyre Strait. It's a legendary creature. You may play an additional land on each of your turns, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So this is a souped up version of Tatiova. I do expect to see this replace Tatiova in a lot of builds. It's just better in all aspects. It only costs 1 additional mana, and you can play an additional land each turn, making it very powerful. Next up, let's go over some of the interaction that we have in this deck. Now, we don't have a ton of interaction, but we did want a couple of single target removal in here. They were able to interact with our opponents when needed. So first up, we've got Swords to Plowshares and Beast Within. Swords to Plowshares lets you exile a creature. Beast Within lets you destroy any permanent, and its controller gets to create a 3/3 beast. Then we've got Nature's Claim and Broken Bond. These are both great at dealing with artifacts and enchantments, and Broken Bond has the added ability of letting you put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield as well, giving you that ramp on that interaction piece. And then we've got Deprive and Dovin's Veto. These are both counter spells. I really like Deprive here, which lets you put a land back in your hand so we can reuse it for landfall. Next up, let's go over all the landfall cards that we have in this deck. Now, this is a Lands Matter deck, so what would a Lands Matter deck be without landfall cards? So first up, we've got Retreat to Emeria and Zendikar's Royal. Both of these cards, whenever you put a land onto the battlefield, you can create a token. Retreat to Emeria creates a core ally, and Zendikar's Royal creates elemental creatures that are 2/2s. Retreat to Emeria also can pump up your creatures if you'd like as well. Retreat to Emeria, whenever you play a land card, you can return target non-land permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. If that land is a plains, you may return it to the battlefield instead. Very powerful card. It's like a repeatable Sun Titan on a creature. Then we've got another couple of ways of creating tokens. We've got Scoot Swarm, Emeria Angel, and Felidar Retreat. Scoot Swarm's very powerful in this deck. Whenever you play a land, you can create a 1/1 green insect token, but if you control 6 or more lands, instead create a copy of Scoot Swarm instead. So if this sits on the battlefield, it's going to be very problematic for your opponents to deal with, making a ton of tokens. And we do have quite a few ways of pumping them up. One of those cards we're going to talk about here in just a second. Emeria Angel, whenever you play a land, you can put a 1/1 white bird token onto the battlefield with flying. And then Felidar Retreat makes either cats, or you can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and they gain vigilance until end of turn. This is very powerful. You can pump up all your creatures, or you can put tokens onto the battlefield depending on what you got going on in that turn. Next up, we've got 3 big haymakers in this deck. These are all going to make tokens as well, but they're going to make some substantially bigger tokens and give you better abilities. Rampaging Balos puts 4/4 beasts into play. Omnath puts 5/5 elemental creatures, and also whenever an elemental you control dies, it deals 3 damage to target creature or player. Phylath is a beating out of Zendikar Rising. When it enters the battlefield, you get to create plant tokens for each basic land you control, similar to Avenger of Zendikar, but way cheaper in the budget. And then it also has, whenever a land enters the battlefield you control, put 4 +1/+1 counters on target plant you control. Next up, we got a couple of cards that can help you finish the game by dealing damage to all of your opponents. It's Tunneling Geopede and Spitfire Lagak. Both of these, whenever a land enters the battlefield you control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So if you have something like Nahiri's Lithoforming and you sack all your lands and put a ton of lands onto the battlefield, this could kill your opponents pretty easily. Then we've got a new one. It's Obun Moldaya Ancestor, which is out of the Zendikar Rising Commander decks. It's a legendary creature. On the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 target land you control becomes an XX elemental creature with trample and haste until end of turn, where X is Ubun's power. It's still a land. And then whenever you play a land, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. This is a really great card for making big creatures that you can attack your opponents with, and also put +1/+1 counters on your creatures as well, which is something that we want to do in this deck. Next up, let's talk about some of the utility cards that we have in this deck. So first up, we've got Rada, Heart of Keld. It's a newer one out of M21. As long as it's your turn, it gets first strike. You may look at the top card of your library at any time, and you may play lands from the top of your library. So this gets you a Courser of Crewfix type effect, which is really powerful. And it does have a nice way of pumping Rada up as well. For a red and a green, and it gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of lands you control. One thing to note with this creature is it does not have trample, so your opponents will be able to block no matter how big it gets. Elvish Reclaimer and Knight of the Reliquary lets you sacrifice lands and search your library for land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. If you're looking for some ways of fixing your mana, these are great at doing that. And not only that, it will help you get your landfall triggers late in the game as well. You can cash in your lands and get another landfall trigger, which is very powerful. Next up, we've got Nahiri's Lithoforming. You can sack X lands. For each land sacked this way, you draw a card. You may play X additional lands this turn. Lands you control enter the battlefield tapped this turn. If you have a lot of landfall creatures or abilities on the battlefield, you can use this as a budget scape shift and get a lot of landfall triggers when you put them onto the battlefield. Next up, we've got Courser of Crewfix. Play with the top card of your library revealed. You may play the top card of your library if it's a land card. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. Very powerful card. It can help you draw cards. If the top card of your library is a land card, you can treat that as basically drawing that card. You can play it with Courser, which is really nice. Then we've got Mina and Den Wildborn. It lets you play an additional land, and then you can pay a red and a green to return a land you control to its owner's hand, and target creature gains trample until end of turn. This is really important because a lot of our creatures in our deck do not have trample, so this is going to help you get some ways of adding trample onto your very powerful creatures that we have in here, especially ones that we're able to pump up with landfall. Next up, let's talk about the combo that we have in this deck. Now, if you've played Tatyova, it's the same combo from Tatyova. We do have some extra pieces in here because we do get white in this deck. We also get red too. First up, we'll go over the ways of drawing cards. We've got Icy and Tatyova. Icy is the brand new one out of Commander Legends, and Tatyova is a very popular commander in her own right. These both let you draw a card whenever a land enters the battlefield under your turn. And then the next piece is Retreat to Coral Helm. This is an enchantment that has landfall, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you can tap or untap target creature or scry one. Now, we really care about the tap and untap, but you can use it for scry one if you don't have the combo set up, so you can try to find the combo. So that is one extra thing to note with this card. And then the very last piece of this combo is a creature that lets you put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. So we've got Sakura Tribe Scout, Sky Shroud Ranger, and Llanowar Scout. These all have the same exact text on them. Sky Shroud Ranger's only exception is that you can only do it at sorcery speed. Then we've got Walking Atlas, Murasa Rootgrazer, and Ruin Ghost. These also do the exact same thing. The only difference here is Murasa Rootgrazer only lets you put a basic land card from your hand onto the battlefield, which isn't as good as the other 4 cards that we just talked about. Ruin Ghost lets you do the exact same thing, except you exile it and then return it back to the battlefield, but you will still get that card draw trigger off of either Tatyova or Isa when you do it. We've also got Badoka Gardener, same exact text. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. The only downside with this guy is when you control 10 or more lands, you got to flip them, and then he can create XX green elemental creature tokens on his flip side, Dukai, Weaver of Life. And then last but not least, you also need another card that allows you to return a land you control back to its owner's hand. And what we decided to put in here is trade routes. There's other cards that do this as well. We decided to put trade routes in here because not only does it let you return a land you control owner's hand, but you can also discard one to draw a card as well. Now, the way this works is you have all 4 of these cards on the battlefield. You pick up a land with trade routes, and then you put it into play with Sakura Tribe Scout. That's going to trigger Tatyova and Retreat to Coral Helm. Retreat to Coral Helm is going to allow you to untap Sakura Tribe Scout, and Tatyova is going to allow you to draw a card and gain a life. Then you tap the mana that you just put into play to pay for trade routes to return that land back to your hand and repeat all over again, drawing your deck and gaining as much life as you would like. And then you may be asking yourself, okay, so the combo's over, now how do I win? So we've got a lot of ways of making tokens, so you can put a lot of tokens onto the battlefield and then swing out at your opponents. We've also got the 2 cards that allow you to deal 1 damage to each of your opponents whenever you play a land card, Tunneling Geopede and Spitfire Lagak. And then that's a way that you can kill all of your opponents by putting lands from your hand onto the battlefield.